This move opens lines for the queen and king's bishop while immediately contesting the center, establishing white's intention for an active and dynamic game. This move, 1, e5, mirrors white's central pawn push, immediately contesting the d4 and d5 squares and opening lines for the queen and king's bishop, establishing a symmetrical and classical pawn structure. This move develops the knight to a central square, attacking black's e5 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, a fundamental principle of opening play. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares to challenge white's knight, a fundamental principle in opening play to control central squares and prepare for castling. This move initiates the Ruy-Lopez opening, a highly theoretical and strategically rich endeavor, by developing the bishop to a strong diagonal where it pressures black's knight and prepares for central pawn advances. This move, a6, challenges white's bishop and forces a decision, aiming to gain space on the queenside and prepare for potential pawn breaks or development. This move continues the Ruy-Lopez opening, maintaining pressure on the knight which indirectly controls black's central pawns and prepares for a future pawn push with d4. This move, nf6, is a standard and active response in the Ruy-Lopez opening, directly attacking white's central pawn and developing a piece. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks for future action along the open files. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares to castle, consolidating black's position within the Ruy-Lopez opening by reinforcing the knight on c6 and aiming to connect the rooks later. This move prepares to reinforce the central pawn with d4 and reclaims the key e1 square, which is often vacated during castling, to potentially support an advance of the e-pawn or redeploy the rook later. This move forces white's bishop to retreat, gaining queenside space and preparing to challenge white's central control with c5. This retreat of the bishop maintains pressure on black's queenside pawns while keeping the bishop on an active diagonal, preventing it from becoming a passive piece in the ensuing pawn structure. This move, d6, prepares to develop the light-squared bishop and solidifies the pawn structure, common in many Ruy-Lopez variations, while also potentially preparing for the na5 maneuver to challenge white's bishop. This move prepares to solidify white's central pawn structure by supporting the d4 push and preventing black's b4 advance, reinforcing the bishop's diagonal. This move completes black's kingside castling, a fundamental part of opening development that safely tucks the king away and connects the rooks for future action. This move prophylactically addresses potential threats along the g1a7 diagonal and prepares to expand on the kingside with g4 later if the opportunity arises. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, reinforcing the kingside defenses while eyeing the central d4 square and potentially creating threats along the long diagonal. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and challenge black's pawn structure, characteristic of many lines within the Ruy-Lopez. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn with nxd4 after nc5, aiming to free black's queenside pawn structure and activate the rooks. This move develops the knight to a more active square, supporting a potential advance of the e-pawn and preparing to challenge black's control of the central squares. This move, 11, bf8, is a strategic repositioning of the bishop to a more active diagonal, reinforcing the kingside and preparing to potentially support a central pawn advance or a kingside attack later. This move challenges black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses and potentially open lines for white's rooks and bishop. This move prepares to contest the central tension and potentially activate the queen on the kingside or support a queenside advance with the upcoming b4. This pawn push centralizes the d5 pawn, aiming to gain space, restrict black's knight on f6, and potentially prepare a kingside attack or a queenside pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to support a central pawn break or to defend against white's queenside pawn advances. This move initiates a pawn break in the center, challenging black's central pawn control and aiming to open lines for white's pieces, particularly the queen and potentially the light-squared bishop. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, potentially preparing to challenge white's central pawn mass and support a kingside initiative. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and preparing to support potential pawn breaks or attacks. This move aims to challenge white's central pawn control and open lines for black's pieces by creating a central pawn break, a key strategic objective in many Ruy-Lopez variations. This move prepares to reinforce the queenside pawn chain and potentially support a future advance with b4, while also providing a retreat square for the bishop if needed. The queen repositions to c7, reinforcing the c6 pawn and preparing for a potential advance of the queenside pawns while keeping an eye on the central d5 pawn. The knight's retreat to f1 prepares to redeploy to g3, reinforcing the kingside defense and potentially supporting an eventual kingside attack after the queenside pawn advances are addressed. The move opens the b-file, creating an imbalance and potential for piece activity on that flank, forcing white to address the pawn structure. This recapture opens the b-file and frees the c-pawn, supporting white's positional advantage by aiming to control the center and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move aims to control the b4 square and prepare for a potential queenside pawn advance while preventing white's knight from occupying the active c4 square. This move prepares to support the kingside with the f-pawn and potentially develop the g-pawn for a central breakthrough or to create a defensive pawn shield. The knight repositions to e7, preparing to support a potential f5 push and regrouping on the kingside, while anticipating white's central expansion. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, likely f5, to support potential pawn breaks or to exert pressure on black's kingside. This move is a strategic repositioning aiming to redeploy the knight from the somewhat passive c8 square to a more active post on e7, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing for a central pawn push after the d5 pawn is better supported. The knight retreats to d2, a passive repositioning that concedes valuable central space and allows black to consolidate their pawns on the queenside. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on b6, eyeing potential breakthroughs on the queenside and supporting the pawn on a5. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it can potentially support advances on the kingside or control the long diagonal after pawn breaks. The move 22, Reb 8 activates the rook along the b-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially create pressure on the queenside pawn structure or support a queenside pawn advance. White reroutes the knight to a more active square, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially attack on the queenside after preparing the advance of the b-pawn. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to contest the d4 square and potentially support a c5 break. while also repositioning it from the potentially vulnerable a6f1 diagonal. The king repositions to a safer square, allowing for potential pawn pushes and reinforcing the kingside defense while preparing for further central maneuvering. This maneuver redirects the knight to a more active square, aiming to support potential breakthroughs on the kingside or exploit weaknesses created by white's pawn structure. This move repositions the knight from the queenside to a more active central square, preparing to support a potential kingside initiative or to challenge black's pawn structure after the previous knight maneuver to nb6. This central pawn exchange opens the c-file for potential piece activity and forces white to decide whether to recapture with the bishop or the knight, impacting future pawn structures. This move recaptures the central pawn, opening lines for your pieces and challenging black's central influence after the pawn exchange. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the d5 square by bringing the queen into a more active central position, potentially creating tactical opportunities and supporting a future pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially support a future attack on the kingside. This move is primarily defensive, tucking the king away from the open c-file and potential checks on the back rank, while preparing to support the d5 pawn from a potential discovery on the queen. This move aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the kingside or supporting a central pawn push, while also unblocking the bishop on d3. This move repositions the queen to a more active square on the queenside, potentially supporting a pawn advance or preparing to contest the b-file against white's knight. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, indirectly pressuring black's queenside pawn structure and potentially preparing for further centralization of pieces or a kingside attack. This exchange simplifies the position and removes a key defender of the c6 square, potentially opening lines for white's pieces, while black aims to consolidate their pieces and prevent immediate threats. This exchange of knights simplifies the position, opening the d-file for potential future activity and allowing white to redeploy their remaining knight to a more active square. This move activates the knight, placing it on a central outpost that pressures white's pawn structure and prepares for further dynamic play in the queenside center. This knight move repositioning aims to contest the d5 square and potentially prepare for a central pawn break, while also bringing the knight to a more active square. This move reroutes the queen to a potentially more active square, defending the c5 knight and preparing to contest the c-file if it opens. This move unifies the rooks on the c-file, preparing to contest control of this open line, which could become a critical theater of operations in the middle game. This move reactivates the rook, eyeing the open d-file and supporting potential pawn advances or piece repositioning to counter white's centralized knight and pressure. This move prepares to exploit the weakened kingside by potentially activating the queen along the g4a8 diagonal and supporting a future kingside pawn storm. This move addresses the immediate threat of the white queen and knight attacking the g6 square, while also preparing to reinforce the kingside defense. This move resolves white's central pawn tension and exchanges a bishop, simplifying the position while opening the c-file for potential future action. This capture is tactically forced, as the knight on e7 was under attack, and while it regains material, it allows white to double their rooks on the c-file, creating significant pressure on black's queenside pawns. The queen repositions to g5, aiming to improve its attacking prospects and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside. while also preparing to defend the vulnerable knight on f5. This move sacrifices a pawn to expose white's king and open lines for black's pieces, creating active counterplay. This move initiates a decisive tactical sequence, exploiting the exposed king and forcing material gain or checkmate. This is a critical defensive move, relocating the king to safety from the immediate check and preparing to defend the weakened dark squares around the king. This captures the pawn and opens the e-file, forcing the black king into a more exposed position and activating white's rook for potential mating threats along the central files. This move aims to reinforce the king's defense by creating a barrier against potential checks and attacks along the g-file, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the rook to a more active square in the center. This move forces black to either move their king or trade queens, leading to a simplified endgame where white's active pieces can press an advantage. The king retreats to a safer square on the back rank, anticipating potential checks or attacks along the open diagonals after the queen's forced departure. This move finally breaks the stalemate on the kingside, creating an immediate threat of mate by exploiting the exposed black king and weakening pawn structure. This move introduces a strong defensive piece to the critical kingside where white's f-pawn has just advanced, aiming to reinforce the king and prepare for potential counterplay. This move prepares to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king, aiming to force a decisive exchange with the rook on g8 or create mating threats. This move seeks to consolidate the king's position and prepare for potential defensive maneuvers, though it might be slightly passive given white's aggressive pawn push. This move sacrifices the rook to break open black's kingside pawn structure and expose the king, aiming to create immediate tactical threats and decisive attacking chances. This challenging move initiates a critical counterattack on white's exposed pieces, aiming to exploit the open lines created by the recent exchanges and disrupt white's king's safety. White initiates a powerful mating attack by exploiting the weakened king's position after black's aggressive pawn sacrifice, aiming to overwhelm the king with pieces while the rook is temporarily out of play. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by activating the bishop, forcing the white king to a less secure square, but it doesn't address white's overwhelming attack on the kingside. The king is being brought closer to the center of the board to escape the immediate mating threats, and to potentially participate in the defense or even counterattack if the opportunity arises. The rook's maneuver to g7 aims to safeguard the king from the immediate threats posed by white's queen and rook, while also preparing for potential counterplay along the third rank or by supporting a future king. Repositioning. This move repositions the rook to the open e-file, aiming to exert pressure on black's weakened kingside and prepare for further attacks. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, supporting the f-pawn's advance and potentially creating counterplay against white's king. This rook move repositions to the third rank, reinforcing the kingside defense and preparing to potentially double rooks on the e-file or swing over to the c-file to contest black's last active piece. This move re-centers the queen, potentially preparing to contest the d-file or regroup to a more active square if white's rook is displaced. White captures the pawn on c5, opening the c-file for their rook and threatening the black queen. This move, by capturing the rook, offers a material sacrifice to disrupt white's kingside attack and potentially open lines for counterplay against the exposed white king. This sacrifice leverages the open g-file and black's exposed king to create a decisive mating attack. Black is forced to capture the attacking queen, but this allows white to deliver a devastating discovered check with the rook, leading to a rapid checkmate. This endgame transition offers white a significant material advantage, converting the complex tactical struggle into a straightforward pawn promotion race where white's extra queen will be decisive. The endgame is now materially equal, but white's queen and rook are active on open lines, while black's knight on a4 is awkwardly placed and vulnerable to attack. White recaptures the rook on a4, activating the rook to a more central file and preparing to exert pressure on black's compromised queenside pawns. This move is a desperate attempt to create some counterplay by sacrificing the rook for a pawn and exposing white's king, but it fails to create sufficient threats against white's vastly superior material and king safety. The king steps onto f2 to escape the immediate threats from the rook and pawn on the g-file, centralizing and preparing to defend against black's counterplay. This move is a desperate check in a lost pawn endgame, aiming to create some last-moment complications or a stalemate threat, though white's king is safely positioned to escape and eventually win with the extra pawn. The king retreats to safety, aiming to regroup behind potential pawn defenses and avoid further checks from the opponent's rook and knight. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weakened pawns on the queenside and preparing to participate in the endgame where peace activity is paramount. The rook sacrifice is a brilliant tactical attempt to exploit black's compromised king safety and force a draw by perpetual check. This rook move is defensive, aiming to connect the remaining rooks and protect the king, but it allows white to maintain pressure on the king with checks and potentially exploit the exposed position of black's king. The rook transfer to the e5 square aims to regain the sacrificed pawn by targeting the weak a4 pawn, and simultaneously preparing for potential tactical threats along the open e-file or by supporting a further pawn push. The move introduces the advanced passed pawn on h3, which, though currently blocked, could become a significant attacking asset in the endgame if white is unable to contain it.